When I moved into that quiet suburban neighborhood, I didn't expect to be noticed. I'd been stationed in some of the toughest places on earth, deserts, remote posts, bases with more barbed wire than buildings. So coming back home to a clean, trimmed lawn kind of life felt almost unreal, peaceful, predictable, maybe even boring. But after nearly 2 decades of wearing a uniform, barking orders, and watching the sunrise through blast-proof windows, barring sounded like a luxury. I didn't want trouble. I didn't want attention. I just wanted a place where I could drink coffee on the porch and not worry if something would explode. The neighborhood was neat. Rows of identical homes with perfect driveways and mailboxes all standing like obedient soldiers. The kind of place that smelled like grilled hot dogs on the weekend and freshly mowed grass every Tuesday. There were American flags on porches, kids on scooters, and dogs that barked like clockwork. It was the kind of order that most people might find dull, but I found comfort in it. I had only been in the house for 2 weeks when I first met them, the HOA enforcers, not neighbors, not residents. These were people with clipboards and walkie-talkies, moving through the streets like they were patrolling a zone under their command. They didn't wave, they didn't smile, just walked slowly past my driveway, scanning every inch like my mailbox might be a threat to public safety. One morning, I was in my garage, unpacking old gear from the last deployment. Boxes of fatigues, boots, medals, maps, pieces of a life most civilians never see. That's when I heard the knock. Not the friendly, hesitant tap of a neighbor introducing themselves. No, this was the sharp, impatient rap of someone who believed they had authority. I opened the door to find 2 people standing there. One man, mid-50s, tall with mirrored sunglasses and a red HOA badge clipped to his belt. The woman beside him was younger, maybe mid-30s, with a permanent frown and a tablet in her hand. "Good morning," the man said, not sounding like he meant it. "We're with the HOA compliance team. We're conducting a review of garages, security adherence, and general conformity." I stared at him for a moment, not speaking, not because I was confused. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Excuse me," I finally said, "we need to inspect your garage interior, vehicle alignment, and general storage." The woman added, like it was the most normal request in the world, "This neighborhood has strict standards." I tilted my head. "You're asking to inspect my garage?" They didn't blink. The man shifted his weight and looked past me, as if trying to see inside. "We noticed that your garage was open multiple times this week. The HOA requires garages to remain closed when not in active use. Also, we saw non-standard storage containers stacked on the left side." I could feel the air tighten around us. I wasn't used to civilians speaking to me like that. Not because I demanded respect, but because most people usually gave it once they knew who I was. But these 2 had no idea, and I didn't tell them. "Not yet. You don't have permission to inspect anything inside my home," I said, my voice flat. Calm, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. The woman looked irritated. "Sir, refusal to comply may result in citation and HOA disciplinary proceedings. Continued non-cooperation can lead to formal action." I stepped outside, letting the garage door close behind me. The mechanical hum echoed as the door rolled down. When it hit the ground, the silence grew heavier. "You want to file a citation because I opened my garage and stacked boxes?" The man stepped forward. "This neighborhood is governed by regulations you agreed to when you purchased the home. We enforce those standards. This is about community, cohesion, and safety." I crossed my arms. "Not out of intimidation, just habit. I know a lot about safety," I said. "But I also know a lot about boundaries." He stared at me, trying to read me. Maybe he saw the posture, the cut of my hair, the way I stood. Maybe something told him I wasn't going to fold. "We're just doing our job," the woman said, "and we'll need a copy of your vehicle. Keys for emergency access. If you park in your driveway overnight, it's part of the emergency access clause." That's when I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was insane. "You want my keys?" I repeated slowly. "Case of emergencies," she said. "It's standard protocol. Let me tell you something. I've handed over classified documents to generals. I've signed off on multi-million-dollar armored transports. I've managed missile codes. But never, not once, have I been asked by a civilian to hand over my personal vehicle keys because I parked in a driveway." I looked both of them in the eyes. "Let me be clear. No one gets my keys. Not the HOA, not the compliance team, not you. That vehicle is my property. And this is my home." They didn't like that. Not one bit. The man straightened his shoulders, trying to assert some kind of presence. "If you're going to be difficult, sir, we can escalate this to the board." I smiled, not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that says, "You're about to find out who you're dealing with. You can escalate it to whoever you like," I said. "But if you think I'm going to hand over keys to people who don't even introduce themselves properly, you've got the wrong man." They left, not storming off, just walking away like they were writing reports in their heads. But I knew this wasn't over. People like that with clipboards and just enough authority to cause problems don't walk away from resistance easily. Later that week, I got my first citation letter. It was delivered in a white envelope tucked under my welcome mat. The letterhead looked official, stamped with the HOAS logo, listing violations such as garage door left open for more than 12 minutes, improper storage visibility, and failure to provide emergency access key as required by HOA vehicle policy. 3 pages of warnings and veiled threats. Talk of fines, hearings, and possible liens. I sat at my kitchen table reading it while sipping black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just the kind of bitter brew that keeps a soldier's mind sharp. I didn't react. I didn't yell or call anyone. I simply began to plan. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I wasn't just some homeowner with a stubborn streak. I was the current commanding officer of a U.S. military base. I oversaw operations, managed teams, handled top-level security protocols, and trained some of the best in the armed forces. Bureaucracy, I knew it better than anyone. Regulations, I lived by them. But I also knew how to deal with overreach. I'd seen it before, in foreign governments, in failed leadership, and yes, even in well-dressed civilians who forgot their limits. So I did what I always do. I gathered information. I read every page of the HOA agreement, every clause, every point. I marked it, studied it like a mission briefing. Then I did some background on the board members. Who they were, where they worked, who they answered to. Within days, I had a clearer picture of their operation than most residents would ever see. And it wasn't clean. They had filed a series of violations against multiple new residents, mostly military, mostly quiet, mostly people who didn't push back. They imposed fines that weren't supported by the bylaws. They cited rules that didn't exist, and worst of all, they had convinced people they had more power than they did. But they hadn't met me before, so I began to prepare my response. Not just a letter, but a detailed, documented report with photos, legal notations, and references to federal homeowner rights. I included proof that their demands were not only unreasonable but legally questionable, and I scheduled a formal meeting with the board. But before that day arrived, things escalated. One evening, I came home late after a long strategy session at base. The sky was dark, the neighborhood calm. I parked in my driveway, took a deep breath, and looked up. There, across the street, standing beneath a streetlight, were the same 2 HOA enforcers. Just standing, watching. That wasn't coincidence, that was a message. But what they didn't know is that I always send one back. I stood there in the driveway, engines still ticking beneath the hood, headlights casting long shadows across the street. The 2 of them didn't move. The clipboard guy and the frowning woman, same posture, same stiff stance, just watching, like they expected something, or maybe they wanted me to react. I didn't. I calmly locked the vehicle, gathered my briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked toward the front door. As I reached the steps, I turned my head just enough to meet their gaze. No words. Just a look, the kind of look that says, I see you, and I'm not impressed. They didn't follow me, but they didn't leave either. Not until I stepped inside and turned off the porch light. Only then did I hear the soft crunch of their shoes on the pavement as they finally walked away. It was intimidation. Subtle, civilian style, and poorly executed. The next morning, I received a reminder slip on my door. A bright orange paper, with bold black letters, mandatory HOA compliance review meeting scheduled. It listed a date, time, and a directive that I bring identification. All HOA documents, and a list of corrective actions taken. It was signed by Acting Enforcement Officer Daniels. That was the man with the sunglasses. They'd put his title in bold. Acting Enforcement Officer. I chuckled. I'd seen that kind of inflated title used a dozen times in a dozen countries. Usually by people who wanted power but didn't have real authority. Titles like Regional Coordinator, Security Liaison, or Compliance Captain. They dress it up, but it's still just a person with a clipboard and a need to feel in control. But I didn't ignore the notice. I didn't shred it, or mock it online. Instead, I documented it, added it to my file, and began preparing for the meeting. Not with arrogance, with precision. The same way I'd prepare to brief the Joint Chiefs, or meet with a foreign ambassador. Because that's how I operate. I don't storm in, I don't shout. I build facts, I build calm. And then I let the facts do the damage. By the time the day of the meeting arrived, I had assembled a complete portfolio. I printed out the HOA bylaws, highlighted the relevant sections, and compiled documented proof that they had violated multiple procedures, including unlawful entry requests and coercive key demands. I even reached out to 2 other homeowners who had received similar notices. One of them was a quiet Navy veteran who had lived there 6 months. She told me she paid 2 fines out of fear they'd take legal action. Another was a widowed man whose trash bins were cited as offensive visual clutter. They'd forced him to keep them behind a fence. He couldn't physically lift due to his age. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. It was a pattern. They were targeting people who were least likely to push back. People who served their country, minded their business, or were too old to fight. That was the real issue. It wasn't about a garage door. It wasn't about boxes. It was about control, and it needed to be addressed. The meeting was held in the HOA's community center, a glorified room with folding chairs, a long plastic table, and a projector that didn't work. A cheap flag stood in the corner like someone ordered it just for decoration. About 5 people sat behind the table, including Daniels and the woman with the tablet. Her name was listed on the agenda as Officer Michelle Carr. Stand, when I entered, they didn't greet me, that I sat down in the lone chair across from them and placed my folder gently on the table. The room was too quiet. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Daniels cleared his throat. Let's begin. We are here today to address multiple violations on your property and your recent known compliance with HOA emergency policy. Before we proceed, do you have anything to say for the record? I looked at him calmly. I'd like to confirm that this meeting is being documented. Yes, Carr said. Notes are being taken. Perfect, I replied, opening my folder. First, I would like to clarify that your request for my keys is not only unsupported by the HOA regulations you're citing, but is also a direct violation of property rights and privacy under state homeowner law. Section 6.3 of your own bylaws clearly states that homeowner vehicle access remains exclusively under resident control, and no clause allows transfer of keys to HOA personnel. Daniels opened his mouth, but I held up a page with the section highlighted. This is from your own documentation. Would you like a copy? He blinked. I continued. Second, regarding your citation of my garage door being open beyond regulation. Time, there is no specific minute count defined anywhere in your policy book. It says garages should remain closed when not in use, which is vague, subjective, and I have footage from my exterior security system showing the door remained open while I was actively unloading. Nothing about that violates your policy. I handed over a small printout of the timestamps. And third, your threat to escalate the issue, unless I complied with an unauthorized request, constitutes coercion. You are neither law enforcement, nor do you represent any public safety agency. This is a residential community. Your role is administrative, not investigative. Carr tried to interrupt. We're just trying to, I kept going. And I understand. You're trying to maintain community standards. But I believe you've forgotten where the line is. You don't get to create policy from nothing. You don't get to intimidate residents into handing over personal property. And you definitely don't get to enforce rules that don't exist. They were quiet now. Daniels leaned back, arms crossed. Carr looked uncomfortable. One of the other board members, an older woman with silver hair and thick glasses, raised her hand gently. May I ask, what is your occupation? I turned to her. I'm the commanding officer of the U.S. Air Force Strategic Logistics Base, 20 miles west of here. I oversee classified operations, maintain one of the most secure sites in the state, and train officers in defense, logistics, and international negotiation. I live here because I wanted peace. I wanted quiet, not this. The room was silent. For the first time since I moved in, I had their full attention. I've led peacekeeping missions, coordinated global relief efforts, and negotiated with military officials overseas. I've also read more regulation books than you can imagine. So when you send me a 3-page citation for having boxes in my garage, I don't get angry. I get prepared. I let that sit for a moment. I'm not here to make trouble. I respect order. I respect rules. But only when they're real. If you continue to push these fake policies on me or anyone else, I'll have no problem escalating this to legal authorities, state housing boards, and the local press. And I'll win. Not because of who I am, but because I read the fine print. You, apparently, don't. Daniels rubbed his forehead. Carr looked down. The older woman leaned into her mic. Thank you, Commander. We will review the policies you've referenced and get back to you with clarification. No need, I said. This is the last meeting I'll attend regarding imaginary rules. If I receive another notice, I will treat it as harassment. I stood, gathered my folder, and walked out. No raised voice, no shouting, just quiet confidence and clear intent. The same way I'd walked into a dozen briefings before, just with fewer flags and more nonsense. But that wasn't the end. Because a week later, I found out I wasn't the only one they'd been harassing, and what I uncovered next went deeper than anyone thought. It was a Wednesday morning when I got the call. Not from the HOA, not from anyone official. It was Mrs. Gates, the widow, who lived 2 doors down. Her voice was trembling slightly, the way it does when someone's both embarrassed and afraid. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, but they came by again. Said something about my plants violating visibility lines. Asked if I had someone who could help me trim the hedges back or they'd start fining me. She wasn't crying, but her voice cracked. I told them my son was coming next week, but they didn't seem to care. They just kept taking pictures. Didn't even ask if I was okay. I thanked her for letting me know, told her I'd stop by. Later that afternoon, after I hung up, I sat in silence for a moment. That's when it clicked. That wasn't about order. This wasn't about rules. This was about targeting people, especially the ones least likely to fight back. They weren't enforcing policy. They were enforcing control. And I'd seen that before, not in neighborhoods, but in regimes. In systems where the illusion of authority was used to crush dissent, bend people into compliance, keep them quiet. And it wasn't just me or Mrs. Gates. Over the next few days, I started walking the neighborhood in the evenings. Nothing suspicious, nothing overt, just casual chats with anyone who was outside. I asked about the HOA, asked if they'd ever been cited. What I learned turned my quiet concern into something much bigger. Mr. Jensen, a Vietnam veteran who rarely left his porch, had received 3 violations in the past month for unauthorized exterior fixtures. Turns out he'd hung a wind chime, a gift from his daughter, and placed a bird feeder by his back gate. Neither were mentioned in the bylaws, but the citations stood. A young couple down the street. Both Navy reservists were fined for non-uniform trash bin placement. Their bins were 4 inches off the designated line, according to a picture the HOA enforcer had taken at 6:30 a.m. on a trash day. Then there was Elena, a single mother who worked night shifts as a nurse. She got a notice about her grass being too tall. After a week of overtime during a local hospital outbreak, she told me they'd threatened a property lien if she didn't pay the fine within 30 days. That's when I knew. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't accidental. They were going after the people who were too busy to read the fine print, too tired to argue, too kind to resist. So I made a plan. First, I gathered every piece of paper I could find. Letters, notices, emails, citations from anyone willing to share. Most were more than willing. Some gave them to me with relief, like they were handing over a burden. Others apologized, as if they'd done something wrong. That's how deep the control had sunk. I built a file, dozens of pages, each one annotated, highlighted, compared to the official HOA charter. Over and over, I found discrepancies. Clauses that didn't exist. Fees that weren't authorized. Deadlines invented out of thin air, and in several cases, outright contradictions. Violations cited for things the handbook explicitly allowed. Next, I researched the HOA's leadership. Daniels, the enforcement officer, wasn't elected. He'd appointed himself after the former board president moved out. Carr, his second-in-command, was listed as the interim administrator, though no record showed she'd ever been voted in. The board hadn't held a public election in 2 years, which, according to the HOA's own guidelines, made their decisions legally unenforceable until proper quorum was re-established. They'd been operating without oversight, without legitimacy, and they'd been using that vacuum to rule by fear. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to keep playing defense. I'd been doing that since I moved in. Now, it was time to go on offense. Not just for me, but for everyone they'd bullied into silence. I filed a formal grievance to the county housing board. Then I made a few phone calls to legal contacts. From my base, nothing aggressive, just consultations. Clarifications. I wanted to be sure everything I did was clean, sharp, and precise. Once I had what I needed, I went door to door again, but this time, not to gather complaints. This time, I brought copies of what I'd compiled. I showed them the real bylaws, showed them how the citations they'd paid or feared weren't legitimate. I explained their rights. And most importantly, I encouraged them to vote, because there was one clause buried in the last pages of the HOA charter, one that Daniels and Carr had probably never expected anyone to read. It allowed for an emergency vote to remove board members if 35% of the neighborhood signed a recall petition, so that's what I did. I walked, knocked, explained, and gathered. Not with pressure, with truth. And let me tell you something. People were ready, they were angry, yes, but more than that, they were relieved. Someone was finally standing up to the people who'd turned their peaceful neighborhood into a paranoid minefield of rulebooks and fines. Within 3 days, I had more than enough signatures. We submitted the petition. The county was notified, and according to law, the HOA had no choice but to schedule a special community vote within 10 days. The notice went out, printed in tiny letters, buried in mailboxes, but this time, we were watching, we were organizing, we were ready. On the day of the vote, I stood outside the community center and greeted every resident who came. Smiles, nods, a few hugs from the older folks. People were turning out, people who'd never once attended a meeting, now showing up with confidence in their step. Inside, Daniels looked pale. Carr was seated stiffly beside him. The board had tried to limit the number of questions, tried to reduce the time, but this wasn't their game anymore. When the final votes were counted, the results were overwhelming. The board was dissolved. Daniels stood up, fumbled with his badge, and placed it on the table. Carr left without a word. No one clapped. It wasn't a movie moment. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, powerful, real, because that's how change happens sometimes. Not with fireworks, but with people simply refusing to be afraid anymore. Afterward, a temporary oversight committee was formed. Residents were invited to nominate new board members. The first to step forward was Mrs. Gates. Her hands were still a little shaky, but her voice was strong. "I've lived here for 19 years, she said. "I think it's time we had someone who believes in kindness and fairness, not power." She got a standing ovation. I didn't run for anything, didn't want a seat. I'd already served my time in command. I was just glad to see the community waking up. But as I walked home that evening, one of the younger neighbors stopped me. He was maybe in his late 20s, new to the area. "Quiet type, sir," he said. "I heard you were in the military." I nodded. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "Thanks for leading this fight. I think a lot of us forgot what leadership really looks like." I smiled, clapped him on the shoulder. "It's not about leading," I said. "It's about knowing when to stand up. Even when it's just your garage, they're coming after, because today, it's that. Tomorrow, who knows?" He nodded, walked on, and I stood there for a minute, breathing in the calm evening air. No noise, no demands, just peace. The kind I'd fought for overseas. The kind I'd earned back here. But I knew this wasn't the end. Because even when you win a battle, there's always someone watching from the sidelines, waiting for their turn to grab power. And soon, a new face appeared in our neighborhood. Someone who claimed they were just monitoring things, but I recognized that look. And I knew the next storm was already forming. It didn't take long before I saw the new figure. About 2 weeks after the vote and the board's quiet exit, a man started showing up in the neighborhood. Not a neighbor, not someone you'd see walking a dog or watering their flowers. This one wore polished shoes, dark slacks, and always carried a tablet. Sometimes he'd stand near the front entrance of the community, watching cars go by. Sometimes, he'd pace the sidewalks in measured steps, glancing at houses like he was taking mental notes. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. People noticed. Of course, a few asked around. No one seemed to know who he was. But then an email went out that it was from a new company, Community Life and Order Solutions, Inc., a third-party HOA management group. The message introduced a man named Vincent Lang as the firm's senior compliance advisor. It said he'd been hired by the outgoing board before the vote was finalized. A last-minute contract. The email was full of soft language, improving structure, bringing professional support, temporary review, period. But I recognized the language for what it was. A shield. They weren't retreating. They were repositioning. I read every line of that email 3 times. Then I printed it out, walked to the garage, and pinned it to the bulletin board beside my old service awards. Because I knew that look in Lang's eye. The calm, calculating expression of someone who doesn't need to shout. The kind who studies you first, then moves when you're not looking. Lang began making rounds. Unlike Daniels or Carr, he didn't try to be intimidating. He didn't flash fake titles or threaten citations. No, he introduced himself politely, wore crisp clothing, asked if everything was working well, but always with that clipboard in hand, always noting something down as you spoke. At first, it seemed harmless. A few residents welcomed the idea of a professional, someone who could clean up the mess, as they put it, but within a month, things shifted. Mrs. Gates received a letter saying her porch light was above standard brightness levels, causing light pollution for nearby homes. Jensen was warned about structural irregularities in his mailbox post, the same post that had stood there unchanged for over a decade. Alina, the nurse, got another warning, this time for improper nighttime parking. The letter cited concerns about visual disorder and guest vehicle tracking. When she asked who had complained, she was told the reports were part of routine observations. That's how it started. Not with force. With suggestion, gentle, polite reminders. Each one worded with legal precision. Not illegal, but heavy. Just enough to make someone feel watched. I knew it wouldn't be long before they came to me again. And they did. It was a Thursday afternoon when I got the knock. Lang stood there with the same patient smile. Pen already in hand. "Commander," he said, "I'd like to have a word, if you don't mind." I stepped out onto the porch. He glanced toward my driveway. "I noticed you installed a side-mounted camera on your garage." "I did," I said. "Standard home security system." Of course, he nodded. "However, some of the residents have raised privacy concerns. They feel uncomfortable with a camera that may capture footage beyond your immediate property." I said nothing, just waited. "I'd like to request a copy of the footage logs, just to confirm the range and any stored imagery," he continued. I stared at him for a moment. "Calm still. You'd like access to my security footage?" I asked. He didn't blink. "Yes, just to ensure the system aligns with community privacy standards." "No such standard exists," I replied. He paused, just for a second, then smiled again. "We're in the process of drafting those. Your cooperation would go a long way toward setting a positive tone for the community." There it was, not a threat, a test. I stepped closer. "I don't hand over footage, data, or personal property to anyone outside of a court order. And if You're setting standards. I suggest you follow lawful procedure and present them to the new board. You'll find this neighborhood is no longer run by shadows and threats." His smile didn't fade, but the corners twitched. "Of course," he said, "just trying to do what's best for everyone." He turned to leave. Before he reached the sidewalk, I called out, "Vincent." He stopped. "This isn't a base, and you're not in charge. You don't get to run compliance with quiet intimidation. We've dealt with that already. If you're looking to enforce policy, do it the right way. And if you're here to bring back the same fear under a new name, don't." He looked at me, long and hard. No anger, just silence. Then he nodded once, walked away. I knew it wouldn't end there. Over the following weeks, the management company pushed harder. Residents began receiving policy drafts by email, all written in vague, complex language: vehicle appearance guidelines, lawn symmetry, expectations, porch accessory limits. It was control, dressed up in civility, but this time, we were ready. The temporary oversight board had grown stronger. People who once stayed quiet now attended meetings, asked questions, demanded clarity, and I helped them organize. Quietly, behind the scenes. Not as a leader, just as someone who'd seen how systems like this operated. We drafted counter-leaders, highlighted flaws in the proposed policies, submitted them through official legal review. When Lang's company tried to schedule a vote to formalize their policies, we called for an open forum. The room was packed, every seat taken. Residents who'd never spoken into a mic stood up and read aloud the letters they'd received. The stories were the same: soft control, fake concern, and behind every smile, pressure. Lang was there, of course, still calm, still smiling. But now, people were watching him the way they used to watch me. With understanding. At the end of the meeting, a motion was passed. The management contract would be reviewed, possibly terminated. Residents would vote again in 30 days, and this time, with their eyes wide open. When I got home that night, I found a small note on my doorstep. No envelope, just a folded slip of paper. It read, "You win this round, Commander, but the game never ends." No name, no signature. I stared at it for a moment, then smiled, because whoever left it didn't understand one simple truth. I wasn't playing a game. I didn't fight for control. I fought for peace, for fairness, for a neighborhood where people didn't feel scared to leave their garage open for 5 minutes or hang a wind chime on their porch. And as long as I lived there, that fight would continue, quiet, steady, and unwavering. I wasn't a man who picked battles, but I never left one unfinished, so if someone wanted to start again, they'd find me waiting. Not because I wanted war, but because peace is something worth defending.